Thank you for joining us. We're going to watch a short video here and see if it's true or what we can learn about Islam in the Philippines. So let's begin. Obviously, I want my comments on this.
Mabuhay, or in Kapampangan, Luwid kayo. Today's question came all the way from Saudi Arabia. Modzna Abdullah, a native of Ligan City, Philippines who now lives in Saudi Arabia, asked, was the Philippines a Muslim?
This is because there's a lot of OFWs, overseas workers throughout the world, especially a lot of Filipinos working in Saudi Arabia. And so maybe this question is also being asked in part because perhaps, I'm just speculating, people are doing dawah to the Filipino and they're trying to say, well, the Philippines was originally Muslim before Christian, therefore if you become a Muslim, you're going back to your historical roots. That could be a dawah perspective, and that could be a reason why this person is asking this question. But of course, if the person's last name is Abdullah, then they're already a Muslim.
Country before it was colonized by different countries. The short answer? Yes and no. Yep. Yes and no. Let's start with no. Why? Because the Philippines back then, well, there was no Philippines back then. The country that we now call the Philippines was a diverse collection of different people, of different states, of different cultures, of different languages.
That's true. There was no Philippines back then because the country is, less than 100 years old for the most part in the formal sense of being a nation. And we'll see what he means by yes and no, and then I will add considerable more depth to it.
Different ethnicities before it was colonized. It's similar to how Indonesia today was not really one Indonesia before Europeans came over to colonize the islands. And yes, there's a lot of similarities between the Philippines and Indonesia that a lot of people do not know about, especially in the Philippines. So yeah, similar to Indonesia, before the Philippines became the Philippines that we know of today, before it was...
And real quick, of course, Philippines named after King Philip of Spain. And King Philip led and funded, you could say, the Reconquista of Spain at the end of the 15th century. And when he led the Reconquista, that was to get rid of Muslims because Muslims were in Spain for 700 years. And there's truth mixed in with myth and all this stuff about the golden age of Spain. Don't get me wrong, Spain had some really, really good years economically, and some peace among some, for lack of a better term for now, we're going to say Spanish Christians and Muslims. But there were times when Muslims did not treat the Spaniards very well, and we can't get into that for sake of time. But if there's a historical paradox here, if you think about it. If early Islam did not spread within the first 100 years of Muhammad into, India, North Africa, and into Western Europe, especially eventually into Spain, and took hold of Spain for about 700 years. Because if you think about it, the Reconquista of Spain wasn't only to push out Muslims and even some Jews, but also because 16th century Spain had the top naval force in the world, and when eventually it came over to make it to the Philippines, and when it came over to the Philippines, it saw the Philippines as an extension of the Reconquista, in part because there were Moros here. And Spain called the Muslims Moros, which was a derogatory term at first. Today, that's not a derogatory term anymore. But that's how they saw when Muslims were here and they called them Moros. They saw the Reconquista of Spain as an extension of that when they got to the Philippines. And there were some Muslims in Manila and Legazpi, and others pushed them down south. But you have to remember, or you have to know, because we have to be, a bit nuanced here, that by the time the Spanish arrived in mid to late 16th century Philippines, southern Philippines, while it was colonized by Islam in the 14th century, by the time the Spanish have arrived, it wasn't that Islam was just everywhere in southern and central Philippines. No, no, no. Actually, it was starting to get a foothold in about late 15th to early 16th century southern Philippines. Because southern Philippines before that term, if we say that Islam came over here from Malacca in about 1390s, more or less, because Malacca was the main port of trading in all of Southeast Asia in the 14th century, on up until probably late 15th century, even up to about 1500, 1510, because the Portuguese came, and that basically the Portuguese put it in because the Muslims ruled the spice trade until the Portuguese and Spanish came. But what I want to say, actually, I won't say it. I'll let him say whatever he's going to say, and then I'll add some key points because we're only a minute into this video.
Colonized and named the Philippines, the islands, all 7,000 islands, was pretty much divided into different nations, different cultures, different language, different...
That's true. We see that because of, again, 7,000 islands, Philippines, 21,000 islands in Indonesia, 100 million people today in Philippines, 250 million in Indonesia, and you have a little bit of different languages and dialects, but before the Muslims came here to the Philippines, you had indigenous, native animism, paganism. But it wasn't, I'm sorry, I'm just losing my voice. It wasn't just paganism and animism. You also had Buddhism and Hinduism here before Islam. There's not a lot of writing to support the evidence for that with regards to Buddhism and Hinduism. But there is some archaeological evidence of that based on some gold archaeology and false god Tara sitting, and some of these other gold statues, smaller statues, sitting in dining position. And so there was Hinduism and Buddhism here because the Malay archipelago, that was Hinduism and Buddhism too before Islam arrived here. So when Islam arrived, not even to the Philippines, but when it arrived to the Malay area, it brought in a lot of Sufism. This is Islam mysticism. And it spread through Islam merchants, through marriage, and we know some of these dates of when Islam came because of the gravestones that they have found. But even some of the names in the Philippines show Hinduism, like Kalinga. Kalinga is not a Filipino or Islamic name. It's pretty much a Hindu name. So there is clear evidence of that within parts of not only Mindanao, but even parts of central Philippines. There was Hinduism and Buddhism going on. Now, don't get me wrong, that probably wouldn't even be pure Hinduism or Buddhism, but would still be synchronism with the pagan, native, indigenous animism as well. But again, if we look at Hinduism and Buddhism, that too is pagan. So it's not ironic or odd that you would have this radical syncretism, especially if it brought native indigenous people a more prosperity lifestyle by adopting or co-opting or adding or putting in some of these, Buddhism and Hinduism even before Islam and Christianity got here. And that's why I'm getting off topic here, but I just need to add why the prosperity gospel is so dangerous, because if pagans can add the prosperity gospel to their false gods, then how much more should we not add false prosperity gospel to Christendom? Let's just be biblical. Now, getting back on topic, let's let this guy speak a little bit more, and then I will add a few things.
They coexisted with each other. They were connected, but it wasn't one nation. It was a collection of different but beautiful and colorful nations. that we need to recognize today. And yes, parts of the Philippines or this island and its pre-colonial societies back then, before Europeans came over, were Muslim. And not just in Mindanao. Most people know how Islam has had a strong presence throughout Mindanao's history. Mindanao is the second largest island in the southern part of the Philippines, southern third of the Philippines. But what a lot of people do not know is that other parts of what is now the Philippines, other parts of the island, were also Muslim. For example, today's capital city, Manila, in the northern island of Luzon, today Manila is the center of the Catholic faith, of the Christian Catholic faith in Asia. But it was once a Muslim walled city called Maynilad before the Spaniards conquered it. So when the Spanish conquistadors took over Maynilad, they literally built...
Yes, and what you have to remember though is some of these places in the Philippines, again, not that Islam just completely washed over the Philippines, this just would be a great historical blunder, just simply a myth that's not true. But yes, that's true. There was a walled city of Muslims. Now the question begins: were these permanent Muslims living there or not? Now, whether they were or not, the point is, in some parts of the Philippines, like some parts of southern Philippines, was used in trading routes, and it wasn't that all the Muslims that lived there were permanent residents. Again, some of these people were basically like sea nomads and traveling from one place to another. And even if you claim that some of these Muslims were pure Muslims, based on evidence that we know, the Sultan of Sulu had at least a dozen wives. The Sultan of Mindanao had at least a dozen wives. In Islam, you can only have 4 wives. So they weren't even practicing that. But there is evidence based on going back even within the last 100 years of syncretism within Islam, and baptizing babies and giving food to pagan gods. And there's also pagan myth stories that goes against Islam there, and say, Mindanao that was still used even when these people were claiming to be Muslims, and as well as simple customs that people in Mindanao adapted into their Islamic beliefs as well, that doesn't sit well with a pure Islam, if that makes sense. Islam isn't monolithic across the board, but you have to ask the question, to what degree of syncretism can one have and then not be considered a Muslim anymore? But some of these people were Muslims. I'm not rejecting that. But again, there was various religious cultures, animism, Buddhism, going on at this time. So, alright, moving on.
Colonial walled city of Intramuros de Manila, literally right on top of the old Muslim walled city called Maynilad. And it wasn't just Maynilad that was the Muslim community in Luzon before Europeans came over. Even in the early part of colonization, there were...
Yeah, I mean, there's also a 10th century Muslim, Abu Ali, in evidence that he was in Mindoro at 977. And Chinese records confirm this. But he was there for pretty much trading, island hopping, to go from here to A to B. But it doesn't seem that these people were creating permanent residences for the sake of pure dawah. Dawah seemed to be, for the most part, that's the keyword, a natural extension of the trade and the prosperity that Islams were doing. It wasn't that dawah was necessarily the primary focus of these Muslim merchants. And again, a lot of these Muslim merchants were considered Sufis, and they were based on Islam mysticism, and Allah is loved, and even you could even collapse a form of Sufism back into pantheism, which Muslims would completely reject that as unorthodox and not Islamic. So it depends on the Muslim, it depends on the time and place.